You're about to watch a recorded session from a live event brought to you by Lower Street, a podcast agency for brands. For more recordings like this or for information on other podcast events we have coming up, head to lowerstreet.co/events.
Today, we're really excited to welcome Stevie Manns. Stevie Manns is an audio producer and a podcast consultant, and currently they are producing BlackRock's award-winning podcast, The Bid. So today, Stevie is going to share some learnings from working on The Bid, talking to us about how to develop your brand superfans and focus on maximizing your internal podcast audience to do so. Stevie has a very prestigious background in podcasting. Stevie's been a speaker at Podcast Movement and She Podcasts, and we're super lucky to have them today to talk to us and to share their experiences. So without further ado, welcome, Stevie. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Annalise. And thank you so much for, I think you mentioned the conversation that we had a few weeks ago and how organic this was. And yeah, I'm just a really big fan of yours and the work that you've been doing for some time. So hi, everyone. My name is Stevie. My pronouns are they, them. And as Annalise mentioned, I'm the producer at BlackRock, and I produce their flagship podcast series, The Bid. So today we're going to look at how to develop your brand's internal superfans using The Bid as a case study. And forgive me, my technical skills on Zoom and PowerPoint aren't what they should be. So if it takes me a second, I apologize. So first off, maybe I can take a step back and give you a little context about what The Bid is and who it's for. So this podcast kicked off in 2018 before my time, and I've been producing The Bid for about 2.5 years. And it really started as an exercise in brand awareness. So a lot of people were not particularly aware of who BlackRock is. And nearly 6 years later, we're finding that a lot of people are much more familiar with us. However, and so the exercise of The Bid in the podcast has really changed, and it's pivoted to become more of a favorability exercise. So getting people to think highly of the firm and the brand. So it is currently hosted by an internal leader at BlackRock, and his name is Oscar Polito. He's the head of our business, which is called Multi-Asset Strategies and Solutions. If you're outside of finance, that means absolutely nothing, and it doesn't mean too much to me either. But he's very smart and he's fantastic. He's a really great host. I think we lucked out so hard. But originally, I think it was they wanted rotating hosts, and I came in and I was like, no, we need a solid host, and that's Oscar. He's really conversational, and I think more importantly, he knows how to keep it at the right level for the audience. And in terms of the audience, we've determined them to be opinion and thought leaders, and we want to be reaching people who have a sphere of influence, and I think that's often very typical for brands. So hopefully this will resonate for you as well. And we expect them to have a 201 level of finance knowledge. So it's not what is an ETF, but it's more what are some of the trends that we are seeing in ETF markets, for example. It is, we are brand and product agnostic. Essentially, we are just sort of, giving our opinions on macroeconomic themes. The episodes are weekly and they're about 20 minutes long. And we've, over the 6 years we've been doing this, we kind of figured that that's where we see the best engagement. So we explore macroeconomic topics on the show, such as, how is AI going to affect our energy consumption, inflation, trends in emerging markets, and new asset classes like cryptocurrency. We do have, and we have been working on, a paid media strategy, but I'll explain why we've sort of pivoted to the internal model in the next slide. So, obviously external paid media is a big thing for brands, and it's super important. But when, frankly, this year, my budget got stolen, as happens, and it sort of got repurposed for some other initiatives that were considered more important, which is absolutely fine. And to be honest, I think I quite enjoy a challenge. I remember there's a photographer friend of mine, and he now photographs for, I think, Rolling Stone, and he started off working with like indie bands on the New York circuit in the city. And one of the things that he said to me was, he loves limits, and he said he started off essentially with one camera and one light, and he learned to get really, really good at that light, using that one light. And I really love that as sort of a parable, if you will, in terms of, how to grow something and how to get better at it. So with this limit in mind, and still with the drive of producing growth for the bid, I thought, how can I do that with the levers that I have internally? So, as I'm sure you're aware, the number one source for new listeners for a podcast is friends and family recommendations. So thinking about that, we have a captive audience, and brands have a captive audience. And if you're not using it, I think you're seriously missing out. So, and really, we figured that, we've got an employee base of about, I think it's probably around 25,000 since I updated the slide. But so, if you've got 25,000 people who are internal to your business or to your brand, you should really be focusing on them in terms of them being the super fans for your podcast, and to drive that favorability and awareness. So thinking about developing the super fan, and this, just using us as an example, we've got, I think, as I say, it's probably about 25,000 now. And it was 19 at the start of the year. And 73 offices across the world. If we had 25,000 people and every single person listened to that episode, then you've got 25,000 downloads per episode just for your internal folks. And it obviously depends on the size of your company, but that's really, I think, where you should be starting, because you've got people who are already bought into the brand, and they can do that friends and family recommendation piece for you. So this is the super fan model. And what I was saying to Annalise was that there is a musician super fan model. And the idea is that as a musician, you can be an independent musician and you can sustain yourself through having 100 super fans. You can, create a living having just 100 super fans. And that doesn't sound like a lot. If you think about being a musician and gigging and selling your music and Spotify and merchandise sales and all of that stuff, it doesn't sound like a lot. But the idea here is that if you have these super fans who are doing a lot of the marketing for you, and they're kind of like on the street and doing it for you, they'll bring in a lot of other people as well, and they'll also go to all of your shows, they'll buy all of your merch, they'll listen to all of your music, and then you can even create music and content specifically for them. And that's sort of like the Patreon model. So thinking about discovery, and what that means, if you're trying to bring people into the superfan phase, it's like, how are they going to discover you? It might be that they hear about you on a playlist. It might be that they see a reel on Instagram or a TikTok. And then, they start to listen to you sort of casually. They've got you on one of their own playlists, and they listen to you a bit more. Then you want to get them to become a regular listener, where they set up an alert for any new music that you have. They listen to your playlists. They listen to your albums when they come out. They come to your shows. And then from the superfan level, it's sort of that level up of they're into everything. Like if you have a podcast, they'll listen to it. If you're on a podcast, they'll listen to it. They'll buy your merchandise. They'll, as I say, come to your shows. They'll bring their friends to their shows. They'll share your music with their friends. And that's the kind of recommendation piece that, we're really going to tap into for this model here. And maybe actually I should ask a question here, and we can get to it at the end. But I'm curious how many of you work for and with brands, and if you've done this kind of internal strategy before. So just drop a comment in the chat, and I'll come to it in a bit. But Annalise, I think, pointed out that this is sort of flipping the funnel model. And so on the left here, we've got the sort of typical, discovery through to superfan, where you've got, you're trying to go as wide as possible and then sort of bring people down to become these superfans. And really what we're trying to do, I think, on the right is have this sort of be a much more sort of organic flow, where you've got your superfans who are, driving a lot of this for you. And it sort of becomes this circular kind of idea where, as I say, they're driving a lot of the advertising for you. And I think, when I started looking at this, I was like, how are we going to tackle all of the different people that we have at BlackRock? We have you have your new grads that come in over summer. You've got your stalwarts who've been at the company for like 20 years. You've got senior people who come in at different levels. And how are you going to get in front of them at all of these different stages in people's careers? And how is it going to matter to them in the same way or not? Like, how are you going to do that? So I think I started looking at like, who are the employees that we're trying to reach? Like what stage in their career are they at, and what are the levers that we have to target them essentially internally. And so obviously you've got your new employees who are Gen Z, and typically I find, if you've got analysts who are coming into the firm, they're usually pretty up on the brand. Like they really want to be there. They've probably maybe checked out the podcast. They've definitely checked out your YouTube. And then if you've got people who've sort of been established in their career and they're making like a lateral move, maybe they've listened to the podcast, maybe they haven't, but how are you going to help them get familiar with the firm and like create that value proposition to them to say, this is what the firm cares about. This is, check out the podcast to learn more about, the broader goals and key messages that we care about. And then, for your veteran employees who have been here for maybe a couple, like 2 to 5 years, maybe more than that, perhaps you've got like internal trainings that you can, target them with. We have something called Student of the Markets. It's a training program where we say, if you're working for a finance firm, you need to know about the markets, and here are all of the different things that we have internally that can help you to do that. And so, we do a little presentation about the bid as part of that mandatory training that they have to go through. And you might have your sort of senior veteran employees where they might be familiar with the bid. Perhaps they remember it from when it launched, 6 years ago. As I mentioned, this has been going for a while, but they're not familiar with maybe what it is now. And obviously podcasts can change over time. And we want to, make sure that they're familiar with what it is now and, how it can matter to them now. So here's kind of the journey of the superfan, kind of moving them through that discovery to casual listener and to superfan. And really like how long, and this was sort of how long I wanted it to take. And it may, we're kind of approaching, I suppose, maybe 9 to 10 months at this point. And I think it's kind of doing what I set out to do, which is great. But so, when you're thinking about discovery, how are people discovering the bid, whether they're, onboarding for the first time in summer. So we've had a new analyst class that was maybe 450 people globally. So they heard about us in the summer, and they're probably in the sort of, hopefully in the regular listener phase now. And, I very much hope for these analysts to be in the superfan class. And I'm starting to see it. I think it's really interesting. Gen Z, as I say, really seems to care. They're really invested, and it's really, really working for them, which I love. But I think and I'll explain some of the levers that we're pulling in order to get them into this cycle. And again, I think what I was noticing probably at the tail end of last year was that, frankly, I think I had the best job. And I was meeting a couple of people at the firm, and they were probably around sort of maybe 25 to 28 range, something like that. And I was telling them what I do, and they were like, oh, I'm not sure, I don't think I know about the podcast. And maybe they'd been at the firm for a few months. And I was like, oh, that's not good. That's really not good. And how can I figure out how to market to them in a way that they suddenly, like, they know what the bid is and they care about it. And at that point, we were already putting it in internal newsletters. Maybe they weren't seeing it. And I had to figure out, like, how do I get this in front of them in a way that's, really going to improve and increase that awareness. And so here I think is where, like, I want to focus for a little bit. So, there's that sort of, and it's all been color coded. It's not just fun branding, but it is our branding, but it is somewhat color coded. And this sort of goes back to the superfan model here, which is, discovery, casual listener, regular listener, and superfan. So in terms of find them, and that's the discovery piece, thinking about our internal folk and how they're going to discover what the bid is. At a very broad level, when we have our analysts come in, that's a great point to get in a lot of people at once. It's a lot harder when people are sort of, just you know, if I wanted to change jobs and I moved to, I don't know, say I moved to Citibank or something, I'm just, you know, that's just me and one person. But you need to figure out that sort of journey for that one person who's going to come at a random point in the year and start their career, you know, with a new company. But so, you know, is it part of your onboarding packet? Is it part of your introduction to the firm if you're an analyst? Is it part of your trainings? Is it part of your mandatory trainings? Is it part of any internal newsletters that you have? And then it's sort of, you know, continuing, so they're kind of seeing it and like you, but you actually sort of want to inform them, and you want your branded podcast to be something that they can look to for information. And so for us, it's, you know, the bid is, you know, financial information, and there's obviously a lot happening in the markets. And if we're making episodes that are timely, somewhat evergreen, but within the themes of what the firm is looking at. So for us, you know, for instance, we're thinking about like the energy transition. We're thinking a lot about AI. These are really sort of topical things. And how can we get our internal employees to think about it in such a way, one, that it informs them and it informs their job, but also that potentially it can inform the conversations that maybe they're having with clients, or you know, that it helps them to kind of see what the broader firm is doing. And actually it can really help drive their own engagement in their careers and their, you know, I guess, feelings about the firm, that they're actually, you know, part of something a bit bigger. But I think, you know, brands in general, I tend to find, are very good at finding people and informing them, that like, and whether that can be internal or external. I don't know necessarily that they're as good at doing that internally, but certainly externally, it's a really big focus. People know how to market, right? But I do find that the latter two, in terms of connecting with people and making content for and with them, are where they fall down. I think, you know, in particular, financial services falls down with this. Some of it can be regulatory, and some of it's reputational. People may not want to engage on social media with people who comment. Our policy certainly is that we don't engage at all with people who are commenting on social media, and that's, you know, that's our decision. But how do you connect with people? And I think, you know, it's sort of creating that relationship. And if you're not asking for feedback, and if you're not asking for people to get involved, how do you do that at an employee level? And so for us, it's like, okay, what are some of the ways that we can actually connect with people one-on-one, and whether that's, you know, getting in front of them. So I think we, you know, for our analyst in our incoming analyst class, we did a couple of Zoom presentations because they were coming in globally. But then we also did a couple of like in-person presentations, and we had them all, you know, we had a bunch of them come into an auditorium, and we did something quite fun. We did, you know, some trivia stuff with them. We did a fireside chat with the host. But we want them to be able to, like, you know, come into the studio with us. We want to sort of offer these like exclusive things to say, you know, sign up for the bid. And, you know, we gave them a QR code, and like we asked them to sign up on Apple Podcasts. We asked them to sign up on YouTube. All of the different platforms that we wanted them to sign up to, and then their name was sort of automatically entered into something to win. And I think we've offered a few things. We offered a lunch and learn with myself and the host for, I think it was 4 people. We offered 2 winners to come behind the scenes to a recording of the podcast in the New York office. And then what was the third or fourth thing? Oh, an Apple HomePod. I managed to, so we do some client events, and I managed to steal an Apple HomePod or 2 that were branded with, you know, the bid on it. So, you know, I think, you know, if you're offering things for people to actually take away or to come in and see, and then, you know, meet the host, meet me, ask questions, all of that stuff, it really, like those signups were massive, and they did far better than I expected them to. And just in the making content for, I think if you offer people the opportunity to co-produce an episode with you, and that can look like anything. Again, it could look like a sort of a competition, you know, and you can offer for a couple of people to, like, you know, be assistant producers with you on it. And it might be that you can ask them, hey, you know, like we're doing an episode on this topic. I'd love, you know, to get a couple of questions from you, or whatever. I've had a couple where we've interviewed some authors, and I think this was pre the days of AI, where I was like, hey, do you want to read this book for me? And create a few questions. And people loved it. I was, made my life easier, and they really enjoyed it. And then we would then have a conversation about their questions, and I say, okay, these questions are great. Now, think about the format of the show and like the story that we're trying to go through, and like it, then helped them to think like a storyteller. So that was really fun for both of us. And another, one of the other key ways that I do this is with employee resource groups. So, we have a number of employee resource groups, like there's the Women's Network, there's the Black Professionals Network, there's the LGBTQ Network. And so, where you're having like Black History Month, or you're having Hispanic Heritage Month, or Veterans Month, for example, we have a few, some of the groups pitch us and they say, hey, we'd love to do an episode in collaboration with. And so these employee resource groups have, networks of thousands of people, and, and they will put this out if you're doing an episode with them in their newsletter. So what we're doing with them is we'll say, okay, let's produce an episode together. It's not sort of super DEI focused. It might be more like, we've got a guest who is a veteran, and we're going to talk to them about a specific business that they grew, and what they learned from that, for instance. And so we'll partner with the veterans group. We'll certainly get them to co-produce it. They can obviously, come behind the scenes. And one thing that we do for this group that I think works particularly well is that we actually produce this live. So we're able to record this, broadcast it live, and then publish the episode later. And when we're doing it live, we can offer like a Q&A session afterwards. So it does also become interactive, as well as making content with and for. So those are some of the key ways that I think we've tried to really connect with and make content for people, as well as informing them throughout the process. And just here's just a couple of results and some very high level overview numbers for you. So the analyst events that I mentioned, I think for just one of them, I think the new subscriber growth was something like 775. The lunch and learn that we did in New York, I think we got about 200 or so signups for that. So just with like two particular events, you've got 1,000 new people signing up, and I think that's great. And that's just from two examples. And then below on the left there, you can see, we had our analyst competition winners, and what we did at the event there on the top left is we said, we invited a couple of people to come up and read out the intro, and the winner of that, intro competition was able to come. And then I think we had somebody else, there was another piece of that competition. So we had two competition winners who came, and they were, so happy to come backstage and be part of that. And here's just sort of a couple of examples. So one thing I forgot to mention is we have a brand ambassador program, where brand ambassadors, or people who are in good standing with the firm, can publish pre-prepared posts on their LinkedIn and socials page. So we'll create the copy, we'll give them a video clip, for example, and then we'll give them the link to the episode, and they can share this on their social media. And so again, when you're doing an employee resource group type of thing, those people will probably also want to share that with their networks to say, oh, like this was something I was involved in. And then that will go out to their external networks as well. And yes, their networks are external. However, if you think about the number of people that you work with, that are on LinkedIn, that you interact with. So yes, it's going internal, even though it's external, if you like. And, we found that, I think the mid-year, at about June of this year, I did a quick check of like how many shares to LinkedIn we'd had. So we had about 781 shares to LinkedIn with, 5,000 or so, engagements, whether that's likes, comments, all of that stuff. And that's, if you wanted to pay for that, I'm sure that would cost a ton of money. And obviously we're getting that for free. A couple of other things, I don't know how, thinking about what your firm is and the digital signage that you might have available. We did a campaign for the 2 millionth download. So we just crossed 2 million downloads over the summer, and we drove a campaign on screensavers. So whenever people were coming into the office, or maybe their screen went dead, it pops up with the bid, and it's like 2 million sharp. So like we're getting the branding there, and we're saying, oh, we've just hit a milestone. We've also got digital signage through the office. So we've got these, TVs, and sometimes it'll be up there with like, Bloomberg TV, but other times we can, push campaigns of other things. So every week when we create a clip of the episode, not only will it go out on LinkedIn, as a sort of 1x1 clip, but we changed the format to be 16:9, as you can see on the bottom right here. And that those will go, across the screens globally. So everyone in every office is seeing this clip of the bid, and it will, hopefully remind them to go and listen. And again, so it's driving that awareness. And, anecdotally, I can say, much as we've got some of these numbers, that's great. But I can tell you anecdotally, the number of people that have come up to me and said, "Oh yeah, like the bid's doing so well," and I'm like, it's really not doing, like, sure, we've had some subscriber growth, but like it's really your perception that's changed, and that's great. So I think from where we were a year ago, where some people were saying to me like, "What's the bid?" to then going, "Oh my God, the bid's doing so well, like that's great." I'm like, okay, exactly, that's exactly where I want them to be. So I think I've talked for over my 20 minutes now, so I'm going to stop sharing and start answering questions. So let's have a look. Hey, Annalise.
You could still talk if you wanted to. I think everybody was very much enjoying that. So thank you so much for taking the time. I don't think anyone was counting the minutes at all. So
okay, great.
yeah, it was great. Awesome. So we do have a couple questions in the chat, but feel free, audience, to throw in some more questions in there. We certainly have time to answer them all. So so please feel free to shoot more questions as they come up. I'm just going to start with a few that have come to mind for me. So to start, Stevie, not all of the brands that are in attendance today are going to have the same kind of owned channels or potential reach as BlackRock. Yeah. Many of them might not have, 19,000 internal employees at their potential reach. And a lot of them might not have the kind of resources to pull off the sort of events or some of the other tactics that you've mentioned. Out of everything that you mentioned today, what would you recommend some of those smaller brands should really focus in on? What did you find were the most effective that would still be available to sort of a smaller brand?
I think, whatever level you're at, hopefully you'll have a newsletter. I think hopefully, you might have a studio in-house. Maybe that's true, maybe that isn't true. Even if you don't have a studio in-house, I think you could still invite people to, if you're recording it over Zoom, if you're recording it over Riverside or Squadcast or whatever, you can still invite people to be participants and to kind of see it happen real time. So I think, certainly that's sort of a way to do it. Yeah, I guess it sort of depends what you're limited to. But as I say, limits are kind of fun. Limits are a challenge. I do think, trying to connect with your internal folk as much as possible. Maybe you can do, a session, like it doesn't have to cost you anything. You could, do a Zoom session about like, oh, hey, do you want to learn about the podcast and like how it can help you? And I think that's the thing, is like saying what the value proposition is to them as a listener and as a brand ambassador. Like, what can you learn from this and how can this help you? I think hopefully would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, particularly for sales teams. I think like a lot of sales teams are still unaware of the podcasts that the brand has, and being able to put that in front of them and share with them like, hey, you could be sharing this podcast with potential clients, or here's an episode that would be really valuable for potential clients. Even just putting that in front of them in an email, I think can be so powerful.
Definitely. And like make sure that they know like what the topics are. Like if, like, oh, this will be really important to you if you're selling something on X. Here's some make it super a bit like accessible to them to just like plug and play and turn it around.
Totally. And very personalized, it sounds like that personalization is super key. When you were talking about getting them involved, another question came to mind for me. It sounds like you really got the team at BlackRock very involved in the production process. How did you sort of feel free to answer this as candidly as you want, but how did you sort of ensure a certain level of quality when you're wanting to include people in the process, but also still need to make sure that the podcast is good at the end of the day? Did you have sort of like guardrails up to prevent a situation where somebody wants to contribute, but their contribution doesn't actually really work for the podcast?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm not the most diplomatic person, being perfectly candid with you. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And I think, I think it's really helpful for people's development. Like, sure, I don't think there's such a thing as a bad idea, but I think, everyone thinks that a podcast is easy, and that's one of the reasons. And it's so sexy and like everyone loves it. But I think, no one really or I certainly find that very few people kind of understand what the process is actually like and what the production process is like. And part of involving them is explaining what that process is. And if, hey, this doesn't work and this, because of this is what the process is, and this, and like, oh, we can't say that because this, like, you know, we've got to, like, legal and compliance won't allow us to say that, or we can't ask that for reputational reasons. That's part of the process that I think is somewhat like, it's kind of lifting the curtain a little bit. And I think, you know, it opens their eyes to like, oh, this isn't as easy as I thought. And I think that's really helpful because, you know, the number of, as you know, the person who leads podcasts for the firm, the number of people who say, come to me and say, oh, hey, we'd love to start a podcast for this business or whatever. And I'm like, no, you don't. And here's why you don't. And they often don't realize really what it takes to start a podcast. But really, you know, if it doesn't work, they need to know why.
Mm-hmm. Did you find it made people respect you a lot more after they were brought in on the process?
Yes. Yes, it did.
I'm sure. Amazing. Okay, so another question that came to mind for me, or another, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, but I think that a lot of times when we're working with clients, the impulse when it comes to marketing the podcast is to reach as many people as we possibly can, to just spread the word as wide as possible. And there's a lot of anxiety around reach, especially in branded podcasts in general, right? Like reach is always a challenge. It takes a lot of time to build a podcast up and to organically build that growth in that audience. Podcasts are really great for reaching niche audiences, but reaching the sort of numbers that you might get from social media, that can be more challenging. So I think the impulse is to sort of spend a lot of money, maybe on paid ads, and just reach as many people as we possibly can. And then a traditional model, you know, you would have like that sort of top of funnel. You'd have people sort of, a bunch of people are going to be aware of the podcast. A handful of those people are going to go and listen to the podcast. A handful of those people are going to listen regularly to the podcast. And then, you know, a handful of them might become super fans. In your model, you're talking about sort of starting off by just targeting the super fans. And that's not to say that you haven't also, you know, tried other approaches to marketing. I know you talked about how you did have a paid marketing strategy in the past. But if a brand wanted to sort of start off by looking at who those super fans are and seeing if they could target them as a starting point, what would you recommend for identifying who those super fans could be and turning them into super fans sort of from the beginning? I know in this case, your sort of model was targeting that internal audience. Do you have any recommendations, maybe from your days as a musician, for like identifying that potential super fan from the very beginning so that you can be more targeted with your marketing?
Sure. That's a great question. It's a hard question, but it's a great question. I totally hear that anxiety around reach, and sure, and frankly, that's, you know, a really big part of our paid media strategy model when it's on, and hopefully it'll be back on next year, and I will, you know, can do a little bit less in my day job with the internal stuff. But I think this is really important as an always on strategy anyway, and I think it's really proven that. I do think though, you know, and we always say this in podcasting, being niche is really key. The riches are in the niches, and I personally say niche, so I hate saying the riches are in the niches, but you know, I'm assuming there's some Americans here, but you know, if you're making a podcast for everyone, you're not making a podcast for anyone. And you know, if you're sort of just going out and trying to, if downloads are the most important thing to you, then I think you need to have a think about why you're doing a podcast and starting it. As a producer, I think it's my job to help educate senior leadership in terms of what are some of the metrics that they need to care about and why. What is this what are you setting out to do with this podcast, and is it doing that for you? If you're just focused on like getting, you know, huge numbers and being like, you know, in the charts or whatever, I don't think that's necessarily the right focus. And particularly if you are a smaller brand, frankly, you're probably, you know, like if you're expecting to you know, to grow to be as big as the Daily, that's not going to happen. We are far past the days that that's even possible. The market is so saturated. It's just not going to happen. Like it just isn't. It's funny because I even asked our global lead of content, and I said, you know, what do you want the legacy of the bit to be? And he said, you know, I'd love it to be like the Daily for finance. And I was like, that's interesting. That is interesting. How realistic do you think that is, based on the fact that one, I'm a one-person team, and two, I have zero paid media budget now. And I think having those conversations about what do you think you can do with this, what do you like, and what are you prepared to invest, versus, like, it can be really key to have a super engaged audience that's smaller, and you like, and to the sort of paid, the musician model, they'll buy everything that you sell. Like, they'll take it in, they'll do everything with it. And that's, if you're looking for advertisers who want a really engaged audience, then you can really sell to them. But in terms of, identifying your super fans, I think creating, like I always say this, like, when you're creating a podcast, to create two avatars of, like, who are your ideal listeners going to be, and give them names and give them backgrounds and everything else, and then make content for those two people. And in terms of turning them into super fans and targeting them, like, if you've created these avatars, and you're like, okay, Susie loves I don't know, horse riding, and you're creating maybe this is a really bad example, and I'll explain why I'm using this example. But I think there was this is a real example. There was a horse veterinarian podcast, and super niche. No one had created this, but, like, obviously there was a real niche audience for this particular type of content, and advertisers can really get in on that, because it's really hard to find, horse veterinarians that, if you want to target them, ads for particular things. And it's, it's a small audience, but they're super engaged. My point being, if you create, an avatar, and you know what Susie's going to like, and then you go, okay, well, where is Susie going to hang out? How am I going to find, like, get this in front of Susie? Is it that, I need to have on guests that Susie follows already? Is it that I need to, maybe I need to advertise on Facebook to particular things that Susie likes? I think thinking it, like, if you're creating that avatar and that person in mind, then I think you can find ways to get to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I mean, in realistically, in the sort of model where you're spreading the word as far as you can, you might have a lot of people who are coming in and trying the podcast, and clicking play, but they might not be listening to the entire episode. They might not be sticking with you for future episodes, or subscribing, or, and that's, at the end of the day, they're not really engaged listeners. And so they're not really ideal listeners, right? Like, they're not, those people are not going to convert and become clients down the road. So having an idea in mind of who you're trying to reach and why you want to reach them, and then really focusing in on them, it might mean you have a smaller audience, but it means that audience is going to be more likely to convert, like you said. Awesome. So my last question, and then I will move on to some of the audience questions. I was wondering, you talked about this a little bit, and you shared some examples. How do you get your internal superfans to then go on and spread the word about the podcast to others? How do you encourage them to tell other people about the podcast? You showed that you had some, like, social copy that was pre-written for them to share,
Mm-hmm.
but is there other ways that you would recommend getting them or encouraging them to share with other people? And how do you get them to do that in a way that feels really organic?
It is a good question. I think, if they're engaged with the content, then, as I say, we've found that they will share on LinkedIn. I think as of June, so we had like 781 shares as of June. At that point, we'd probably had like 25 episodes. So that's a fairly decent amount of people who are engaged that just want to share it based on, like, the content. So I think from that perspective, like, if they are engaged in the content, if they're interested in the content, and what I found was really interesting, like, if you're looking across the type of content that they're sharing, maybe it's not the type of content that you think they'd want to share. And that was really eye-opening for me, to look at, like, okay, what were the highest, what types of content were shared the most? Or was it about the person? Was it about the content type? I think obviously we did one with our CEO. That one obviously got shared. Naturally, that was going to get shared. It's always a really big activate, like big campaign moment for us. But then I think that the next one after that was quite surprising. It was an external author that we'd had on, and it was about how to be I think it was titled something like How to Be a Stoic Investor. And so it was more behavioral. It wasn't sort of macroeconomic. And I probably do maybe 2 authors a year. And it's sort of a little bit different. It's definitely evergreen. It'll, like, as a producer, it allows me to, like, if I've got a few things in the pipeline that are going to move around, then this allows me to sort of drop this in when I need it. If, for instance, something drops out, or gets moved back. Certain campaigns and whatever have to move back if for whatever reason. So that one was, again, as I say, it was not something that it wasn't a huge focus for me. But this guy, he had a book that came out. He'd gone through his publisher. I think I'm on a list for like Penguin or Random House or something, and it was in one of the lists. And I was like, oh, this sounds really interesting. Maybe I'll check in with him. And he has a decent following. He's got a podcast of his own, so he has a group of really engaged people. And that one I think got shared the most after the CEO. And I was like, oh, that is not what I thought. And so having this sort of idea of like, what is the content that resonates with your employees? What is the content that resonates with, external folk? And it was also, really, the engagement was really, really high for that as well. So I think, you can make the content that you want to make, but sometimes it's always a real check to like your own sanity of like, am I making content for people, or am I making the content that I've been told to make? And that can be really helpful to then turn around and say, actually, this content does really well. I think we need to make more of this. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. And it kind of ties into actually the next question that's coming from the audience. So Tom asked, did you run any surveys to learn more about your audience? And if yes, what were the key insights? How many responded to the survey? So part of that maybe is related to like what was interesting for people to hear more about. But yeah, I'm interested to hear if you did happen to run any kind of listener surveys.
I haven't done that yet. That is on my list. As I say, I'm a one-person producer, and so creating a weekly show plus also doing like the internal stuff and creating the stuff for external is a lot. It is on my list. I've been reading, and I've sort of gotten halfway through Tom Webster's book, and he talks about like the sort of survey, and because I think I wanted to do it, but I was like, what are the questions that I need to ask to really get the answers that I want to get? So I haven't done anything formally, and that I think will also require I need to give something away for this. And what else do I have left? I think I have some of these mugs here that I frankly didn't come out quite the way I wanted, but I might actually just say, fill out this survey and I'll give you a free mug. So sure, I think that would work. But I think, in terms of like what questions to ask, it's like, why do you listen? If you are a listener of the bid, why do you listen? Or if you don't listen to the bid, why don't you listen? Like really find out like what the value proposition is for them. But I think, frankly, I need to go and read Tom's book so I think it really is just like figuring out the why. And I think like, the 5 whys, like you just keep digging down and digging down. I think really like that's what I want to get out of a listener survey.
I think you're the third person who's brought up Tom's book to me today, so I need to hurry up and finish that book now.
But I would just one other thing with that. I would just say like your internal listeners might not be the same demographic as your external who you want to reach. So I think just bear in mind that whilst they might listen and that's great and you want them to be super fans, they might have different reasons.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like the focus on super fans also kind of gives you a much more direct access to that audience. Like it's more personal, right? And it's a smaller audience, it's more one-to-one. So I'm sure you've had more conversations with people internally about the podcast since you started the strategy, right? But as you say, like those conversations are valuable, but it's not necessarily the same sort of responses that you would get from an external audience for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The next question I have for you is from Debbie. And she says, when you've connected with employees, what have they said are the benefits to them of the podcast? So again, sort of similar topic and building off of it.
Yeah. For them, it's sort of getting to know who senior leadership are. It's getting to know about, the campaigns that we care about. And it's like, frankly, we create a lot of white papers. And this is a way to learn about things without having to read a really long, boring white paper.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's a really smart reason to have a podcast as a brand. Okay, so the next question is from Lola. Do you have social media followers for the bid? And if so, how do you convert them to listeners?
Good
Is there
question.
any specific campaigns that you run?
Good question. So our social media policy is that we have different social media for different things. The bid doesn't have its own social media. That's a decision that has been made yon high. What we do have is LinkedIn for the firm, we have YouTube for the firm, and we have LinkedIn and Twitter. LinkedIn is sort of, free for all, for like, you can sort of share various, things about the firm. We, publish statements that we want to publish. Our Instagram is for like what it's like to work at BlackRock. So I find it very hard to get stuff onto our Instagram. Because I think often, stuff that's about the bid isn't necessarily about BlackRock, and that's for a good reason. Like, the two are very, very separate. We do I've started to use YouTube a lot this year, and really like shorts. I'm mixing up my shorts and my reels. But using shorts has been really beneficial to us, I think. So I post the full video. So, the full video edited and everything goes onto YouTube. And also the clips that, I have one by one that go onto LinkedIn, we reformat that for 9:16, and those go onto shorts. And obviously we, try and drive from the short to the full length video. Frankly, I don't think that works terribly well. I think YouTube hasn't really set it up to work well. Because it's not sort of quite like TikTok. It's like a tiny line of text that just says, listen to or go to the next video. It doesn't pop up with like the thumbnail or anything. So that doesn't necessarily work that well, but we do, get a lot of subscribers to the channel for that. So we have the bid as a playlist, and we've got the bid videos as a playlist, and we also have the podcast on that. So I think to your question, probably the thing that we would use the most is LinkedIn, where we have like one link, and it goes to YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, and people, and like with the individual episodes, and you can select whichever one you want to check it out on. Because I think, in the past, I think we pushed people to Apple Podcasts only. And as we know, Apple doesn't have the stranglehold it once did over the market. So I think it's smart to make sure that you've got a landing page and people can select.
Yeah. And do you use Linkfire for that then? Or
no, we use Bitly.
Yes. Oh, okay. Interesting. Very cool. I think that makes it makes a lot of sense. I think it's really hard to get people to go from scrolling on their phones to then downloading a podcast episode. So I don't know. I don't know if you find that there's probably other values there too, though, from having the clips on social media. Like, even if people aren't going from scrolling on LinkedIn and then downloading episodes, it still probably adds a lot of value to BlackRock to have that content there.
For sure. And I think it was you that posted about, like, people watching the clips seem to think that, oh yeah, I've watched the episode, I've seen it, type of thing. And so I think counting those as part of your metrics should be important to you. Yeah,
totally. I think that's really important too. Okay, so the last question that we have is a kind of a fun one for you and a compliment to you. Despite all of the successes that you've had, why do you still work alone and not with a team?
It's not a choice. It's not a choice. I have put in budget to get some help, and maybe that'll happen next year. So we'll see. But I would love a helper, frankly, and I think it would certainly allow me to do a bit more with to someone's point about the survey. I would certainly be able to do that very easily. Versus, I'm pulled in a lot of different directions. We also do lives in front of, clients at client events. Those are really labor intensive. I really enjoy doing them. I get to go and travel and do all of that stuff, but like, that's super labor intensive, and like, the turnaround for that. So it would allow me to do a lot more stuff while and prepare for different things. So.
Have you found a big impact on those live events now that you've since launching the strategy? Reaching internal audiences? Yeah, that seems like something that would probably see a big uptick after having more of an internal strategy.
Very much. We did we did 2 lives in Australia this year. It was great fun. And we found that I think Australia was probably 5th, in terms of international, we are maybe 70% US, 30% international. Of that 30%, I think 15% is EMEA and 15% is APAC. In terms of like country rankings, Australia was probably number 5. It moved from 5 to 3, like just from having QR codes and like, oh hey, make sure you sign up, like a call to action, like directly in it. They were getting some, we were offering something really unique that like our competitors didn't offer, and we were like, hey, make sure you sign up to the bid, or like get your phones out right now, and everyone, like, they're doing it. And then, by having that QR code, you can really directly correlate what event, you can certainly create a unique QR code if you want to, or you can be lazy as I was, and you just know by the date, right? And you track it back. But yeah, that we got a lot of signups for that. We do see, really, I think certainly strong engagement for the podcast, but also strong favorability for the firm because we're doing something that's unique. This, if we're doing, I think we just did one in London, and rather than do it on the main stage, which was how we had done it previously, we were sort of the session that we'd selected, because I think we were looking at topics, was like a breakout session, and it was oversubscribed, and it was just absolutely packed of like 50 people into a room, and it's really, as I say, limits. We had this really, really small room. It probably wasn't much bigger than my office, maybe a little bit deeper. And we had, our great creative team, came in and created like a wraparound, and we sort of made it look like a studio.
Cool.
And yeah, people loved it. It's unique.
Did you find that those events were we're getting so much more attention after this internal strategy because you had local employees are now aware of the bid and they're inviting other people, like external people to the events then?
Yep. Absolutely.
Amazing. So very much like the musician strategy of like reaching your super fans, and then they invite people and bring them along to the events. Yeah.
Yep.
It's difficult to get people out for live events with podcasts just because your audience is so fragmented and so global. I think it's really hard to get people out to come to live things. So that definitely seems like that strategy was smart and well timed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends sort of what your podcast is. And I mean, as I say, I think I started off doing a music-based podcast, and it was in support of a live event. So I think one of the original podcasts I started was I was doing like a songwriters evening. And like interviewing the individual songwriters sort of became marketing for the show. And then it sort of ended up flipping during the pandemic, and then the podcast became the main thing. But so originally, like a live show was somewhat part of it. I never actually broadcast the live show itself. I could have done, and that could have been a bonus. And that, but you need to think about what that means for you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We had one more question right at the end, and it was asking about when the bid is on hiatus. Does the bid ever go on hiatus? Do you ever? I know it's like
I do.
So what do you sort of do during those times to keep things going and to keep engagement up?
I do best of episodes. So over the summer, I don't publish new episodes during July and August. What I do is I record 4 new intros with the host, and we record, and they're like 5 minutes. So we pick 4 of our best episodes from the last 6 to 8 months. So we probably even go into like last year, and then we'll say, oh, hey, and so it'll be me and the host, and we'll be like, hey, this is, thinking back on like our favorite episodes. This is one, and what did you learn, and yada, yada, 5 minutes. So it's like really, really small production. And rather than publish it every week, we'll publish it every other week. So that, 1, gives me time to have a vacation, and 2, it gives me time to plan Q3, Q4, which are always so busy. Over Christmas and the holidays, usually I would do a holiday episode, and it's sort of like a quiz episode. We did it last year. It was quite fun. The engagement wasn't as high as I wanted it to be, but I think it didn't necessarily matter. I just didn't want to create new content for the sake of it. And I think then we sort of signaled, hey, this is the end, and then we'll be picking up January 6th. So I think we signaled, hey, we may or may not post any best ofs, but we'll pick up in the new year. But I do think it's important to take that time off for yourself if you are like a one-person band, as I am, to try and it does give you that time for production and planning.
Absolutely. We only have like 3 minutes left. I have one last sort of wrap-up question for you. If you had to pinpoint what the biggest impact has been of running this internal campaign and this campaign focused on superfans, what would you say has been the biggest result that you've seen in the last year or so since you started running it?
I think just the anecdotal feedback of like, oh, hey, like the bid's doing really well, or I saw that clip on there, or and certainly for me, seeing some of these numbers, because I have someone who's somewhat adjacent and has been helping with some of these things, and she's been doing, she helped organize the analyst event. So I didn't see the numbers until I requested them. And I was quite taken aback that, we got like 1,000 downloads essentially, or sorry, 1,000 subscribers just from doing these two particular events. And that's before I'd even counted the rest. And I was like, okay, yeah. And like, I'm seeing numbers kind of tick up, but if you were, I think it was September last year with the iOS update, and everyone kind of saw their numbers drop by somewhere between 15 and 25%. And really, like, we've been fighting back, trying to sort of get up to those numbers, because once your senior leadership have an expectation of numbers in mind, that's what they want to see going forward. So I'm like, oh crap, how do we get ourselves back to that level? And it's been a bit of a struggle, without any paid media budget. But we've started to tick up, and I think now that we're not seeing download numbers for people who aren't engaging, we're actually starting to see these numbers are people who are fully engaged. That's been great. And the anecdotal thing of people saying, oh, the bid's doing really well, and I'm like, no, you just think it is, or knowing what it is has been great. So I think for me it's set out to do what I wanted it to do and a bit more.
Totally. Yeah, a huge benefit of this is even just getting that internal support. If you're making a branded podcast inside of a brand, like you are aware of how important that internal support is, and that support from your seniors, and the awareness of what's happening from them is huge in the success of the show. So super helpful. Well, thank you so much, Stevie. This is the end of my questions. This has been so great, and you were so smart, and we really, really appreciate your time. So
thank you so much. I really
us.
appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Everybody who's here, thank you so much for coming. All of the attendees. We will be having another office hours coming up very shortly. It'll be on December 11th, and that'll be our last office hours of 2024. We'll be joined by Shannon Young from Seattle University, and we'll be talking about podcasts for academic institutions. So please join us and sign up then. And you can catch a rerun or a replay of this podcast or this session. It'll be in your inboxes very shortly as well. So yeah, that's everything from us. Thank you so much.
Thanks.